good to have you on the program.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Matt, what is behind the National Bank of Angola's decision to cut rates when all other banks, central banks, global central banks, are hiking rates at the moment?
Yeah, so this is a key question. It's a highly unusual move, as we've been talking about recently a lot on this program, but also seeing around the world. Most central banks are increasing interest rates, partly driven by fears of higher inflation, so an attempt to contain inflation, but also because there's pressure from interest rate hikes in Europe and the Eurozone and the US, for example. In Angola's case, however, we're seeing quite a unique set of economic factors coming together. So what we've seen in the country is inflation is actually slowing. So inflation has slowed every month since the beginning of this year, from a high of about 28% year on year to about 19% at the last reading in August. And we've also seen the Kwanzaa perform extremely well against the dollar. It has actually been the world's best performing currency against the US dollar since the beginning of this year. It has appreciated by about 30%. And this is because of the country's position of benefiting extremely well from very high oil prices over the last year or so, especially since the war in Ukraine began. So what we've seen is a significant increase in forex reserves in Angola. This has had a very direct effect on the currency, which in turn has pulled down the inflation rate because the cost of imports in Angola has fallen. So the National Bank of Angola is in a unique position at the moment to be able to cut interest rates when most other central banks are increasing.
So you mentioned that the Kwanzaa has appreciated by about 30% recently against the dollars. No other currencies, emerging economies are suffering at the moment. How do you think the Kwanzaa will perform over the coming year? Do you think this strengthening of the Kwanzaa will be sustained?
Yeah, so this is the key question. We have seen the Kwanzaa level off over the last couple of months. So it's hovering at around about 420 to the dollar after significant appreciation at the beginning of this year. Our view is that we expect it to lose a little bit of value, so it will depreciate slightly and gradually over the next maybe 6 months and next year. But we're not going to see a severe depreciation. And this is because there will be some movement against, there is general movement against emerging market currencies, and the Kwanzaa will be no exception. But oil prices remain historically high, and oil production in Angola will continue to increase. So oil production had declined pretty much every year for the last decade, but this is now going into reverse. We're beginning to see new investments into oil production, and consequently, oil production has increased for the first time over the last couple of months. And so this bodes very well for forex revenues in the country. And so this will prevent the Kwanzaa from depreciating significantly. But there is something, and so we do expect to see the Kwanzaa average probably about 500 per dollar next year. So this is still well below what we were seeing last year, which was about 620. But there's another factor to think about, that is politics. We have seen the election over the last month or so. There's probably going to be a little bit more investor confidence in the market now that the anxiety around the uncertainty generated by the election is over. So this will also support the Kwanzaa to an extent.
Okay, so now that the election that you mentioned has passed, what can we expect from João Lorenzos' second term?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because Mr. Lourenço was, he came to power in 2017 as an economic reformer, and there were great expectations put on him, and he actually, to an extent, did manage to liberalize parts of the economy, introduce economic reforms, including the liberalization of the exchange rate. And this is why we've seen a significant improvement in access to foreign currency, access to dollars in Angola over the last few years. The expectation or the hope is that there will be more pro-business reforms, more privatization of state-owned enterprises, encouraging foreign direct investment. But unfortunately, Mr. Lourenço is relatively constrained in terms of his scope to push more aggressive business reform, pro-business reform. And this is because the governing MPLA party performed quite poorly at the election. So it was its worst ever performance since the end of the Civil War in 2002. It got just over 50% of the vote. And as a result, we expect there to be a bit of soul searching within the MPLA party. There's probably going to be a little bit of infighting between the senior ranks of the the party, and this will mean that Mr. Lorenzo will be a little bit more cautious in advocating for economic reform, especially if it targets vested interests within the government. So we're probably going to see policy continuity, a relatively pro-business stance overall, but we're unlikely to see major economic reform as the MPLA tries to shore up its power base and support in the country.
Thanks so much, Matt, for that update. And we'll continue to track how Angola's decision will impact the economy and how other economies will be performing against, these recent hikes and inflationary environment that we find ourselves. Thank you so much, Matt Kindiga, Practice Lead, Sub-Saharan Africa, for joining us today.
Thanks very much.